these pictures here of what tunnels do. Same thing here is that we see the ceiling hitting the floor.
That image right there is very interesting because in researching the way the stars move around the flat Earth,
Mm-hmm.
and by the way, I'm going to get into this with you guys. I want to talk about the work of Charles Fort because that needs to be put right into the middle of the flat Earth conversation and his 4 books. And then also Rudolf Steiner.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things you see in this image right here is this is similar to a time lapse image of the stars moving around the Earth,
Mm-hmm.
and it looks like we're in a tunnel. It looks like we're in a tunnel.
Yeah, it does.
Which gives rise to my belief system that the Earth has a hyperdimensional shape, or it's flat against a rotund heavens, which means you're basically flat versus curvature. You can't actually jibe those together because pi makes the jibing irrational.
Right.
Right? Because a circle can't be squared and a square cannot be circled without pi, and pi can never match a straight line or a 90-degree angle because pi is irrational and has to do with all circles and all curvature. So we live, the point I'm driving at, and this is
Mm-hmm.
the point that Charles Fort brings up in his books, is we live in a rational, irrational construct. Ultimately, we cannot ever get to the bottom of the mechanics that make the heavens work and makes the earth work and what's underneath our feet, what's above our head, because it's rational, irrational. And to me, every horizon is a rational, irrational phenomena right there in front of us at all times. We know there's irrational phenomena that go on, UFO stuff, Bigfoot, whatever. All that kind of stuff it's on the fringe of our rationality. It's arguably irrational. And part of this whole mechanistic, materialistic scientism is trying to get us to believe that everything is rational and mechanical and materialistic. And what Charles Fort presents in his 4 books is that there's only one conclusion you can come to when you analyze the evidence. His evidence was accumulated by 25 years of living in the New York City Public Library as a full-time job. And, he was basically the internet of his age. He realized that there are phenomena that just are simply irrational and can't be materialistically explained. Steiner says it this way. He says that there are forces in nature that compete against each other and are fighting against each other, and so there is no possibility of a universal force. There is no possibility of getting to a unified field, or the Einsteinian vision of like, oh, we can just if we understand these forces, we can predict everything that's going to happen in the future. That's not possible according to Steiner and also Victor Schauberger, the great water wizard, because in nature there are forces that are competing against each other, and they're not unified.
Mm-hmm.
So that clip was from the Globebusters episode from a couple of weeks ago. It turned out to be a fairly interesting interview with Jaron and his guest, David Avocado Wolf. And I thought it was interesting for the first one just being on, it was kind of cool in a way that they're talking about the same sort of things that I was recently focusing on in the video I did on the celestial sphere. With the idea of the perceived dome of stars as sort of appearing like a sort of projection, but being influenced by things like perspective and atmospheric lensing, which Jaron even mentioned in there. And David goes on and mentions the whole hyperdimensional aspect of the heavens, and starts talking about his own research and background involving figures like Charles Fort and Rudolf Steiner, both of whom I want to talk about some more in a minute. But I just wanted to, openly state that I do respect both Jaron and David Avocado Wolf, who I'd never heard before this interview, but I find them both to be, very intelligent and reflective people, and they provide a lot of interesting things to consider and research further, even if our views on spirituality, might be in pretty stark contrast. But I was struck by how Wolf mentions the whole point of squaring the circle, or circling the square, and so forth. When talking about that whole relationship between the Earth and the sky, as we continue pondering this ever so puzzling question of how we're living on a demonstrably flat plane while seeing the appearance of this celestial dome overhead. And that's the theme that I've been seeing pop up again and again over the past year or year and a half, as I've been exploring just the whole topic of flat Earth and ancient cosmology. And I never really expected that to come up so much. It, was more something that obviously we all know, squaring the circle as being sort of this phrase that stems from geometry, and then if you're at all familiar with the esoteric side, you also know that this is a term that comes up a lot. And so basically at this point, I guess I've come to understand is that for whatever else it might be applied to, it seems to, at least to a large degree, kind of function as this kind of overarching, metaphor for this whole dynamic of the interplay between the earthly and the heavenly, or the physical and the spiritual. And as David Wolf described it in that clip, he speaks of it in terms of the rational versus the irrational, and these seemingly, these seemingly incongruent worlds or incongruent dimensions, And so anyways, this whole relationship of the earthly with the heavenly, or the temporal with the eternal, or all the different ways you could describe it, the rational with the irrational, and just the whole mystery of how those things interact, right, which is kind of represented by this flat earth investigation and research. And hearing somebody like David Avocado Wolf talking about, well, why he thinks guys like Charles Fort and Rudolf Steiner should be at the center of the whole conversation, that really stuck out to me as just another example of what I've been seeing so much, to where it's just a perfect example of how this whole issue, the whole topic of cosmology and flat earth, absolutely is a segue, a gateway into esoteric studies and occultism for many people. I mean, obviously Wolf was already into these guys before coming to flat earth, but just seeing it as this opportunity to apply things that have been written in the past. And I don't think either of them were flat earthers, but actually Fort seems to have written a book that was defending a geocentric globe. But anyways, it's interesting. Speaking of Fort and Rudolf Steiner, Charles Fort is the guy who the Fortean Times is named after, and there's a Fortean society, I believe, that was erected in his name, even though it wasn't. It was friends and colleagues of his, but he was this writer, not so much he was more sort of this writer at the beginning of the 20th century that was very interested in the paranormal. Basically, he seems to be the guy where the whole concept of the quote-unquote paranormal comes from, where he was just investigating sort of unexplained phenomena, in science journals and various writings, and sort of collecting them and gathering them, and wasn't himself so much necessarily offering some sort of esoteric or magical explanation for things. It was just more about rejecting the hardline materialistic scientific rationale behind things. So it was kind of a stepping stone, and that it's interesting too, because I know when I was much younger, I was always very, very intrigued by sort of those the paranormal or the unexplained in it. And today, we've always seen, a lot of those things are sort of gateways towards into more esoteric studies, and so there is that relationship there between the paranormal and occultism. Like I said, it's sort of a gateway drug, I guess, to occult studies. Rudolf Steiner, on the other hand, is certainly not on the level of a gateway to the occult, but in his case, we're talking about a bona fide hardcore occultist there, coming from the Theosophical Society and branching off from them. When I think it was when Annie Besant, chose to hail the Krishnamurti guy from India as their new messiah, and there was a big sort of shakeup within the Theosophical Society, which I talked about in my video on the Hoover Dam, actually. But anyhow, Steiner, branched off and started his own school of thought called Anthroposophy. So basically, he just created his own branch of the Theosophical Society. And yeah, if you know anything about the Theosophical Society and its roots with the UN and Lucifer's Trust, which became Lucius Trust, and again, it just points back to all these same connections to the occultist, globalist elites. Again, I think anyone who tries to convince themselves that there's like any true meaningful difference between the occultism of the New World Order, elites, and any other occultism. That is to fall into the trap of the most effective example of the Hegelian dialectic of the false dichotomy that's really ever been put into place. This false dichotomy between the good occultists and the bad occultists, or the good magic and the magic is neutral, and then some people use this esoteric knowledge for good and some use it for bad, and that is just an absolute lie and an absolute delusion. Because if you look at the belief, what is actually being taught, ultimately it's still the same monistic evolution gospel. If you go and listen to what Rudolf Steiner taught, you don't have to listen very long to realize that it's no different than what Manly P. Hall and Aleister Crowley and the founders of the Theosophical Society, and they all have their own little flavors and their own little discrepancies, but in the end it's still the same thing. Just different flavors of the same poison Kool-Aid. So like I said, it's really interesting to me how this whole analogy of squaring the circle, even though it's applied by the occult realm as sort of just the whole crux of what they're after, the merging of the fallen angelic realm with the human realm, with the whole goal of bridging that divide. But that's the counterfeit. Whereas the Bible itself actually does talk about this too, which, like in 1 Corinthians 15, where it's talking about earthly bodies and heavenly bodies, and how essentially, what Jesus did at the cross and through his resurrection, he's really the only way to the quote unquote square the circle. He's the only one that bridged that divide. He's the only one that can bring together the rational and the irrational, and merge the realms and merge the divide. And when I think about it this way, it's kind of exciting, because it's kind of serves as a point of contact for the whole conversation. A different way of presenting the gospel and a different way of explaining the gospel. And that's what I hope to do with this documentary series that I've been talking about. But I'm actually going to get started on some serious writing and editing and putting it together. And this whole theme is going to be sort of a guiding a guiding theme throughout it. So we'll see how it goes with that. So all right, thanks for listening. Who laid the foundations of this world? What is the nature of the skies above? Where are the boundaries between these realms? When was our understanding of the cosmos lost? And why is there this battle for heaven and earth?